Welcome to Not So Quiet on the Western Front, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the First World War. I'm Dan Hill, a military historian and battlefield guide specialising in the history of the war on the Western Front.
And I'm Dr. Spencer Jones, author and senior lecturer in war studies at the University of Wolverhampton. In this episode, we continue our canter through the story of cavalry in the Great War. From its impressive performance in the mobile warfare of 1914, we'll explore its changing role in a war of much more limited opportunity for mounted troops, before looking at its re-emergence in 1918 as an altered but crucial force on the battlefield. Well, hi Dan, it's part 2 of our canter, I did like that line, our canter through the history of cavalry in the First World War, and specifically cavalry on the Western Front. And when we left the cavalry in our earlier episode, the trench lines had formed, everything had settled into position, stalemate really reigned along the Western Front, and all the armies were drawing breath, recovering from their losses in 1914. But it's interesting to me, Dan, that at the end of that period of 1914, opinions about cavalry, especially in the British Army, were actually quite positive, and a lot of people were looking into 1915 as only a matter of time before the cavalry became good again.
Yeah, hi Spence. I think as you mentioned at the end of the last episode, the last but one, for those listening in, of course, we kind of left things with that idea of trench warfare not necessarily being a permanent state of affairs, kind of dangling in the air. And I think that's a really important point to kick off with, actually. You know, by 1915, trench warfare is the new thing. Mobile war has been the order of the day really up until about, let's call it October of 1914. So a big portion of what we've seen so far has been mobile warfare. And of course, a great number of people see it going back in that direction. And in that sense, cavalry very much has a role to play. What role that's going to be exactly is maybe going to be changed even as early as that point, because it's become fairly clear that this kind of booted knee to booted knee cavalry charge en masse isn't really going to be the order of the day. That being said, some role for cavalry, perhaps in reconnaissance, perhaps in pursuit of a retreating enemy, is certainly envisioned and not really that far-fetched, in my opinion. It takes me back to that great concept that's used, Spence, the into the blue attack. And if we're looking purely from a British perspective here, the idea, of course, is to smash a hole through no man's land, break into and through the German lines. And my God, cavalry's going to be pretty handy if that happens.
It certainly is. And a really important point here that we did mention, I think, at the end of last episode, but worth reiterating, is that people in 1915, commanders, politicians, a significant number of them, really the majority of them, especially on the Allied side, don't expect the Western Front to last indefinitely. They think it might last a few weeks, a few months. The moment the weather improves in the spring of 1915, the British and the French are going to try and attack and break this trench line. And the expectation is warfare will go back to looking as it did in 1914, with lots of maneuver. You're going to need mobile troops for that. You're going to need your cavalry for all the duties it did in 1914, reconnaissance, screening, pursuit, and simply maneuvering around the battlefield. But there's one caveat to this that I would put in, and that's that although the British are looking ahead to a world where the Western Front breaks and their cavalry can do well again, we have to bear in mind that of the major European armies in Europe in 1914, it's only really the British Army that's had a really positive experience using its cavalry, and we discussed that 2 episodes ago. Very good in a mobile role, very good reconnaissance and screening, small actions. The French and the Germans have not had a positive experience with their cavalry. In fact, by the end of 1914, both French and German cavalry is basically written off, at least for the time being, because it's just burned through all of its horses. Thousands of horses have been, in the terminology of the day, they've been expended by the French and the Germans in 1914, and those horses are not easy to replace. We discussed 2 episodes ago, the French and the German cavalry is not as well trained as the British, and that's been shown on the battlefield. Although there's been some small successes, and one bigger one when the French cavalry assisted at the Battle of Le Cateau, in general, French and German cavalry have done very little. And in fact, the Germans at the end of 1914 issue all their cavalry with bayonets. A few months later, in July 15, they withdraw swords from all their cavalry. And actually, between the end of 1914 and really the middle part of 1916, all but one of the German cavalry divisions, and they'd started with 10, all but one German cavalry division is withdrawn and is sent to the Eastern Front. The one division that remains actually is a police force that operates in Belgium. So effectively, the Germans remove all their cavalry. There's some what's called divisional cavalry, small units that are operating alongside infantry divisions. Not many people there. You're talking no more than 100 or so per division. They see some action during the retreat to the Hindenburg Line in the spring of 17, but effectively German cavalry ceases to play a significant role on the battlefield in the West. And the French, too, go through a similar experience. The French cavalry's done very little in 1914. And one thing that's needed at the end of that year is there's a desperate need for replacements. France has lost over 1 million men in 1914. Anybody who is a trained soldier is going to be required. And since the cavalry has done very little, a lot of cavalry, NCOs, officers and men get transferred into other arms. By May 1915, half of all of the French cavalry's entire NCO numbers have moved to the infantry. Thousands of French cavalry officers have gone to other arms, especially the Air Force and later the tanks. And the French cavalry is basically slowly but surely reducing itself throughout the war. By the end of 1915, all the French cavalry have to form a so-called dismounted group, which is a light regiment, really. And they gradually convert themselves into what are called trench cavalrymen. Not a great role for them, it has to be said. And there's competing ideas, actually, in the French army about what to do with their cavalry. Joseph Joffre wants to see French cavalry probably become a bit more like British cavalry, move into this mounted infantry role where there's a mixture of horse-mounted troops and also there's substantial motor transport, but reforms are really slow and opportunities for action involving these forces are basically non-existent. And when Pétain becomes commander in 1917, he actually seriously thinks about disbanding the cavalry entirely, but he hesitates for understandable reasons, and he actually hesitates for reasons that he states as he doesn't want to completely destroy an arm that could never be created again. And I think that's a powerful thought in the context of 1917. And by 1918, there's very little French cavalry left. And in fact, as mobile warfare breaks out again in 1918, the French actually appeal to their old cavalrymen and officers, come back to the cavalry, we need you. And just 350 volunteers agree to go back to the cavalry. That's, I think, shows the status the cavalry sunk to in France in 1918. French cavalry does fight in the 100 Days, fights at the Second Marne in July 1918, fights again in Flanders in October 1918, but it doesn't achieve very much. So I've discussed this at length at the head of the episode because I think it's important, Dan, that we're really focusing on British cavalry because Germans and the French effectively leave their cavalry to one side. They don't play a major role in the West, but the British always retain a significant cavalry force, largely because of that training we discussed, the positive experience they had. But of course, Dan, the battlefields of 1915 and beyond, they're really different to the battlefields of 1914 because now we're talking about cavalry in the trenches.
Yeah, and I think this is where this clash of ideas comes about, and there's something about talking about cavalry and talking about trench warfare. The two clearly don't mesh, and I think that's where a lot of people, if you were to ask a man on the street and say, tell me about cavalry in the First World War, I think that concept is going to come up more than any other. The truth is, it's pretty rare for cavalry to be employed in that kind of role, and for obvious reasons. It's really the emergence of things like industrial amounts and grade of barbed wire. It just basically forms an impenetrable barrier for men, machines, and of course cavalry. If you add to that the state of the ground, the fact that we've got machine guns, really sewing up all of no man's land, you've got heavy artillery fire. The idea of putting conventional cavalry in a conventional role through the middle of no man's land is a no-go, and in fact would be utterly suicidal. That being said, I think the biggest thing that the cavalry does in 1915 is still represent a threat. Not necessarily one that's acted upon, but it does represent a threat that needs to be considered by Germans in their defensive posture. If somebody was to break through, if there was to be a breakthrough in the British sector, for example, and there was a genuine opportunity to exploit success, cavalry could be employed. And the Germans need to consider this in their planning, in their defensive structures, and in terms of where they deploy their reserves, because cavalry can still be very, very useful. The problem is, how do we break through that crust? And we've discussed it numerous times now. The idea of punching a hole in the British line. Break-ins possible, breakthrough very, very difficult, certainly until we get to 1917 and then on to 1918, when we start to see things change again. But this idea of cavalry being employed in anything meaningful on the Western Front is certainly not really going to be realistic for this stage of the war. That being said, cavalry are employed elsewhere. We're talking about, of course, the Western Front predominantly here, but no doubt we'll segue slightly off. Cavalry are actually employed in a ground role as well, dismounted role, famously in Gallipoli in the Suvla Bay campaign. They're going to attack across the salt flats. That's dismounted cavalry that are going to be doing that job. So there are still roles in the kind of emergence of the new style of ground fighting. But as far as my thoughts take me on this, Spence, the idea of cavalry actually in action at the front really kind of, you can almost draw a line under it, with a few notable exceptions in 1915. There's one or two in 1916, which no doubt we'll get onto as we get into this story. But really, the changing role, if you like, is going to be the less sexy lines of communication and stuff behind the lines, which is still vital to the war effort.
It is, and it speaks to this problem that the cavalry start to get in 1915. As you've outlined, Dan, it's impossible to just send cavalry charging across no man's land. They won't get anywhere. They'll be blown to pieces. They'll be hung up on the barbed wire. So cavalry doesn't have an immediate battlefield role in 1915. You've got all these mounted troops, and they're waiting for something to do. One thing they can do is operate on the lines of communications and in the rear areas. Cavalry make for very, very good police forces. They can ride around, they have an air of authority, they can drum people into business. They're good at rounding up stragglers. And incidentally, the United States Army travels to France with a significant number of cavalry units. You don't see any action, actually, in the American campaign, but are very good for rounding up stragglers, especially during the Meuse-Argonne campaign. And British cavalry, and I should add Indian cavalry, because the Indian cavalry divisions remain on the Western Front for some time. They don't actually leave until 1918. So British and Indian cavalry, joined by Canadian and Australian horsemen as the war goes on, are useful in that sense. But what they're really looking for is an appropriate opportunity to abandon this behind the lines work and actually get into action. And it's not just waiting for an opportunity for action, it's also solving a number of problems about, okay, let's assume that a breach has been made in the German lines, and that's what the Allies are ultimately seeking in 1915. Then you've got to move your cavalry into that breach. And one thing that the cavalry have not got any experience with is navigating trenches and no man's land. Because this is a very difficult and dangerous environment. You've got cratered no man's land. You've got to somehow move your cavalry through the trenches. It's not great. You don't want your cavalry falling into trenches. You're going to have to use bridging equipment to cross trenches. You're going to have to make sure the barbed wire's out of the way. If there's poison gas in the area, you're going to have to put gas masks on your horses, which is something that there are pictures of this around. Apparently horses actually do quite well in gas masks. They're not, if they're trained to wear one, they're not discomforted by it. And horses are actually quite resilient, it turns out, to most forms of poison gas, apart from mustard gas. But even so, it's not great. And just the simple act of actually moving through the battlefield to even get to the point you can begin your attack is a problem, the like of which the cavalry's never even thought about before the First World War. And I'm sure listeners, many of you will have seen the film War Horse, and I think that captures something of that idea. Not least, of course, the dangers of machine guns, very rapid-firing machine guns at a line of horses, poses a lot of potential risks, Dan.
Yeah, it does. And I think this comes back to one of the major downfalls of cavalry, particularly being anywhere near the front line. One, they're just a big target. Cavalry can be a huge target. A man on a bulky horse and lots of them in a world where artillery is dominant on the battlefield and for a number of miles behind it, particularly with the invention of things like aircraft, which can now fly over scout positions. But very hard to hide a cavalry formation. You can do it a little better with infantry, but to hide cavalry, quite a tricky thing to do. So, if your cavalry column gets caught on the road and you've got enemy artillery within range and a German aircraft flies over spotting for it, that's going to be a recipe for disaster. And so, there are lots of things that we have to contend with here. And of course, the big issue with that is that really cavalry need to be on hand to exploit success. We're going to see this in a big way at Cambrai in 1917. But in terms of actually being on the spot or thereabouts, they're always going to be within danger if they're as close as they need to be. And so that's for one reason why we just see really a lack of opportunity to exploit. That being said, there are a couple of notable exceptions, Spence. One famous one on the Somme, no less, on the Bazentin Ridge, with an attack just as the second phase of the Somme fighting kicks off down towards High Wood. We see the famous advance, slightly mythologized, we might say, of the 20th Deccan Horse who are going to go into action on the Somme, but not in the way that it was envisaged. Actually, they're going to really take on this short-range paratrooper role, but they do pretty well, Spence.
Well, they do, and just before we get onto the Deccan Horse and indeed the 7th Dragoon Guards who are also involved in that, it's worth just summarising or picking up on the point you made about cavalry are big targets. They have a big footprint in the battlefield, and that means you have to avoid them being hit by even stray fire, stray artillery fire or stray machine gun fire, or being observed by German aircraft and having fire brought down on them. There's this tension. You need to keep them a certain distance away from the front line. Otherwise, they're going to take needless casualties. But at the same time, the very nature of their strengths, this ability to carry out this short-range paratrooper role, a very quick advance to seize an objective, maybe even go further into the enemy position, you need to really seize fleeting opportunities. And if your cavalry is a long way from the front line, you're never going to achieve those opportunities. It's just not going to happen. And that's really the story of 1915. There's always cavalry behind the lines for the British offensives in 1915. But even when those offensives achieve something, so Neuve-Chapelle, parts of Loos in the autumn of 1915, cavalry's nowhere near it. It can't go anywhere. It's got no opportunity to engage. It's too far away. And so it doesn't actually do anything. And the Somme as well is actually an interesting example. Before we even get onto the Deccan Horse and the 7th Dragoon Guards, it's worth considering that in the build-up to the Somme, there's a major role for cavalry is envisaged by the British commander Douglas Haig. But there's actually a tension about, well, what's the cavalry going to do? And Douglas Haig, who I've described previously as a compound optimist, he gets a good idea, he likes it, he builds it in his mind. I think Haig, who's a very experienced cavalryman himself, he begins with this idea of using British cavalry in this traditional short-range paratrooper role. Have them up close to the infantry, try and use them to seize small key objectives. But then he compounds this, and then gets this idea he might push through entire cavalry divisions, 9,000 horsemen in certain places. And there's a big cavalry component to the Somme. But most of it ends up in the wrong place. Most of it is up in the north near Thiepval, where there's no opportunity for cavalry to do anything. What they were meant to do around Thiepval is a mystery. There's a hugely fortified village, totally inappropriate for cavalry deployment. The one place where they could have done something useful is down in the south, with 13th Corps, which is fighting alongside French 20th Corps on its right. The French and 13th Corps capture all their day one objectives. Not an easy fight, but a completely successful fight. And on 13th Corps front, the Germans are broken for a time. For a few hours, the German defense is basically routed. They're retreating in disorder. They're abandoning equipment. And there's a legend that I think begins with Martin Middlebrook's seminal book, First Day of the Somme, and has been repeated many times since, that the commander of 13th Corps, Walter Congreve, VC, actually calls 4th Army's commander, Henry Rawlinson, on the 1st of July, reports the situation and says, I want cavalry reserves put in here. And Rawlinson says no. It's a great story. It's not a true story. There aren't any cavalry reserves here. The British haven't planned for a breakthrough on this part of the front. And I think that shows some of the tension. Even when you do have a breakthrough, if the cavalry aren't there, they can't take advantage of it. But this leads us into the Deccan Horse and 7th Dragoon Guards, because a few weeks after this, on the 14th of July, fighting around the Bazentin Ridge, the battle is not mobile at the Somme. Absolutely not. But the trench lines are being broken up. And opportunities are beginning to emerge for cavalry. And it's interesting, the cavalry brigade that's involved on the 14th of July is the Secunderabad Cavalry Brigade, and it's a really imperial force. 2 Indian cavalry regiments, a British cavalry regiment, a Canadian squadron with specialist trench bridging equipment, some armoured cars, some artillery and some machine guns. Very, very modern fighting force in many respects. And we know about, or many of us, I'm sure, on the podcast will know, the 20th Deccan Horse and the 7th Dragoon Guards actually charge in the vicinity of High Wood and actually capture a number of German soldiers and may even sabre and lance some unfortunate German soldiers in the process. It's one of the most mythologized, I think, moments on the Battle of the Somme. But if we break it down about what really happens here, in some ways it's the same old story. The Secunderabad Brigade's actually in position at 9:30 a.m, ready to go, but doesn't receive any orders to advance, and it doesn't go into the attack until about 6:30 in the evening. Now, it does advance. Squadrons of these units go forward and charge, genuinely charge, and only suffer relatively light casualties. About 8 men are killed, and maybe 100 are wounded in various forms. More horses are killed and wounded in this. And they actually charge, capture a small portion of their objective, and take out some German defenders. What's interesting to me, Dan, is this: a number of people witness this. It's a busy battlefield. And subsequently, the retelling of this battle has grown and grown and grown and got crazier and crazier and crazier. And a lot of our accounts of this charge actually come from decades later, from 60 years later or 50 years later. And by then, people had remembered seeing the cavalry, but their memory of it had changed a lot. And a lot of our accounts that are left talk about ranks of horsemen going down, mown down, blown up, machine gunned. Nobody makes it out alive. It's a charge of the Light Brigade situation. But in reality, when you actually look at the action, it's very small scale, only 8 dead, very light casualties by the standards of the Battle of the Somme, and ultimately they achieve their objective. But I think that speaks of something too, Dan, and that's that if you were an infantryman down on the Somme and you saw some Indian cavalry go charging past you, you might be forgiven for getting a bit confused about what happened decades later.
Yeah, it's the old Christmas truce football match all over again, right? It's the same situation we see there. You know, these stories grow in the telling. Of course, if you ask somebody, they say, "Yep, I remember seeing it," or "Bill in B Company definitely saw it. He saw these Indians charging against machine guns." And you go and ask Bill in B Company, and he says, "Well, actually, no, it wasn't me. It was Fred in A Company who saw it." And you ask Fred, and he heard it from somebody in a different battalion. You know, in some cases, of course, there are eyewitness accounts, but the reality is, you know, a bit of Chinese whispers here throughout time. We've got the war diaries, we've got the records, we've got fairly actually good documentary evidence which tells us exactly what happens. It's much less glamorous, but it's actually more successful than really the history, the modern history will tell us. Quite simply, a group of guys go in, they manage to grab a strategic point. They do overrun a couple of German machine guns and capture a significant amount of German prisoners. Remember, this is what cavalry are designed to do. They're designed to exploit gaps when the enemy is disorganized or withdrawing or retreating. And it's the old mantra, speed kills. It's classic. It's exactly what the cavalry are meant to do. They go in at a key point, in a key location. They sow quite a lot of confusion. They bog down on their positions deliberately. They hold their positions. And then later on, they're going to withdraw actually under the cover of darkness that night. So it's a reasonably successful event as far as cavalry on the Western Front goes. And, you know, that's a pretty niche area to find success in. But it goes to show that cavalry, even in trench warfare, are not absolutely obsolete. And there are other opportunities spent. It's not limited to just the Battle of the Somme. In fact, you could argue the very next year, there's an even bigger opportunity, which is at the Battle of Arras.
Time of the Battle of Arras is perhaps the best opportunity the cavalry have up until this point of the war. There's a lot going for them at the Battle of Arras. The cavalry have really tried to study what's happened at the Battle of the Somme and tried to learn from it. So they've identified some of the problems we've been talking about. Cavalry are held too far back from the front line. Cavalry have to find a way to negotiate really shattered terrain. And keen-eared listeners, you'll notice that the Secunderabad Cavalry Brigade with the Deccan Horse included a trench bridging squadron with them. That's a solution to a problem. You've got to find a way to cross trenches. And by 1917, the cavalry have developed even further. They're now more heavily armed than ever. Cavalry carrying their own mortars, their own light machine guns, their own grenades. Experience now at moving around a battlefield and learning from what had happened really at the Somme, where a lot of opportunities, it was felt by the cavalry, had been missed. And at Arras as well, they're being commanded, their overall commander is Edmund Allenby, who was a very experienced cavalry officer. He commanded the cavalry division way back in 1914. And he actually writes in his initial plan for Arras, he outlines what he wants the cavalry to do. And I think he captures really this short-range paratrooper role perfectly. And he wrote, with the cavalry, the essence of success lies in moving forward rapidly before German reinforcements arrive on the scene. Once the ground is gained, it will not be difficult to hold it against counterattacks, having in view the great increase in firepower now made available by machine guns. And proportionately, by this stage of the First World War, a British cavalry squadron has got a lot of firepower, a lot of machine guns. Hotchkiss guns are its preferred light gun. Bring those up, get those into position. You can really lay down a lot of fire with those. And there's a reasonable amount actually expected from the cavalry at the Battle of Arras. They're going to be kept up quite close to the front. Allenby is going to try and compensate for these problems that he believes has occurred at the Somme. But there's various things start to go wrong. Inevitably, there are problems getting the cavalry in the right position, and the weather is absolutely excruciating as well. Freezing cold at the Battle of Arras. Winter of 16 to 17 is the fourth coldest winter in the entire 20th century in Europe. So imagine being actually in the trenches. And it's brutal on the horses. A lot of horses are sick. A lot of horses actually die of exposure in the build-up to the Battle of Arras. So that limits their opportunities. And there are some successes for the cavalry at Arras. Notably, 8th Cavalry Brigade captures Monchy on the 11th of April. A little bit controversial. If you go to Monchy now, there's a memorial there claiming the 37th Division has captured it. But if you go elsewhere, there's also other units claimed to have captured it. And certainly some 37th Division troops were in the village. But 8th Cavalry then came riding up to reinforce this group, which had been very badly handled. And in some ways, it's the model of a short-ranged assault. Cavalry moving quickly, deploying their machine guns and supporting weapons around the village, waiting for a German counterattack. But it also shows some of the weaknesses of the cavalry approach, because one thing the cavalry do is they can dig themselves in, but where do you put your horses? If you put your horses too far back, you're going to lose all your mobility and you're going to cease to be cavalry. And what 8th Cavalry do is they keep their horses too close, anticipating the rest of 37th Division is going to leapfrog into them and allow the cavalry to start maneuvering again. And that doesn't happen. There's a breakdown of communication. There's problems. And what the Germans do is they absolutely pound the village to rubble with their artillery. And unfortunately, 8th Cavalry Brigade loses between 500 and 1,000 horses. And I have to read a quote out from an infantryman from 37th Division who remembered going up to the captured village at the end of the fighting. And he remembered seeing this. Heaped on top of one another, and blocking up the roadway for as far as one could see, lay the mutilated bodies of our men and their horses. These bodies, torn and gaping, had stiffened into fantastic attitudes. All the hollows of the road were filled with blood. This was the cavalry. And unfortunately, that is the risk you take with your cavalry. If you do use them in the short-range paratrooper role, you capture a location, but reinforcements don't come up fast enough, they can't hold on indefinitely, not unlike paratroopers in the Second World War, Dan.
Yeah, it's a good point. And it also comes back to this supply issue as well, because not only have you got to bring up ammunition, you've got to bring up various different things just to get those guys dug in. So entrenching tools, equipment, new barbed wire, etc., etc. You also got to bring up fodder and things like that into really advanced positions. Cavalry simply can't last without having some kind of sustenance. So it really adds to the complexities of being able to do that. It's a good example, though, Spence, that you pointed out there. And I think this is that clash of ideas. It's what cavalry can achieve against what can happen if you come up against a seriously industrialized battlefield. And that those numbers alone, I think, sum it up quite well. 500 to 1,000 horses destroyed, just absolutely annihilated by artillery. And there's no way to dig them in. You've got to have horse holders, 1/4 of your entire force moving back to hold on to them. You can maybe try and picket them in woods, but try and find a wood on the Western Front with anything like leaves in it around this time of the war, very difficult to do. So we do see this this issue, particularly. I mean, whilst the cavalry does still retain opportunities, really a lot of it, almost exclusively now, has to be looked at in terms of the terrain. And so when we come to Third Ypres, we're talking about a battlefield that's already been fought over for years, massively chewed up by artillery. Again, lack of woods, not really much sunken lanes and rolling terrain in which you can hide cavalry in. Flat ground is going to be really difficult to try and conceal any kind of large force of cavalry. So really there's no opportunity for the entire of Third Ypres to employ cavalry. But it is decided when there's a further attack that comes in towards the end of the year, and it's really over fairly virgin ground in the sense that it's still pretty good going, not particularly churned up. It is foreseen, though, that there could be a real employment for cavalry, and that's going to be at the Battle of Cambrai.
Absolutely right. And just to link this to Arras, although we've laid out that 8th Cavalry Brigade has a grueling experience in Monchy at Arras, the actual feeling at the end of the battle is actually, although the casualties were heavy, the cavalry did what it was there to do. It leapfrogged forward. It took an objective. The problem was it then had to hold it for much longer than it really should have done. Where was the follow-up wave? It never appeared. And I don't think anyone's hugely discouraged by what's happened at Arras, which may sound strange to you listeners given the casualties, but ultimately 8th Cavalry Brigade has succeeded in what it's trying to do. At a heavy loss, but it succeeded. And people were thinking in the cavalry, well, we can see more and more opportunities. We can just get this right. And Cambrai seemed like the absolute opportunity to do this. We've never actually covered Cambrai on the podcast. We haven't yet. I'm sure we will in the future. But of course, it's a very sophisticated battle. You have over 300 British tanks are involved. You have a surprise British bombardment where it's firing unregistered. It's firing from the map to achieve surprise, which means the ground won't be pitted and churned. You've got tanks to destroy the barbed wire belt. You've got 106 Greys fuse to destroy the barbed wire belt. There's a real expectation that the tanks will make the break in, and then the cavalry can pass through that gap, and they can thunder off, and they can seize the next objectives beyond them. Well, Cambrai doesn't go according to that plan. It's a hugely controversial battle. In fact, I think now in the 21st century, we've largely forgotten how controversial it is at the time, because this is a battle where everything starts brilliantly. Church bells get rung in Britain to celebrate a victory for the first time in the war. It's a real moment of catharsis. But everything starts to go wrong. The British can't capture ball on wood. More and more tanks go out of action for various reasons, and then the Germans counterattack and claw back almost all the ground they've lost. And in the midst of this, the cavalry have almost no opportunity for action. It's really, really grim for them. And once the battle is over, the army itself tends to see Cambrai as a defeat. It hasn't really gained any terrain, heavy losses, and an opportunity has gone begging, and everybody's looking for a scapegoat. The tankers, the tank corps, they blame the cavalry. The infantry blame the cavalry. The artillery blame the cavalry. And it gets so bad, in fact, that there's a House of Commons debate in December 1917 where the use of cavalry was described in this debate as obviously absurd in British Parliament. And Major Hammond of the Tank Corps, who writes a very influential report about this battle, which goes back, he's widely read in Britain, he commented, "Those poor horse soldiers were a pitiful sight in modern war." And this moment where the cavalry really doesn't achieve anything significant at Cambrai, I think this is a moment where really the mood completely turns against cavalry. There's been criticism of cavalry up until this point, but everybody wants somebody to blame. Cavalry really cop it badly at Cambrai, but I'm not entirely sure that it's completely fair criticism, because a lot of the old mistakes, keeping the cavalry too far back, asking them to do too much in dismal weather, they resurface. And also at Cambrai, you've got an enormous canal the cavalry have to cross too.
Yeah, and it all comes down to terrain once again. As you said, I think the same old problems really sums this up, but it's the same old problems writ large on a very large scale and a very public one as well, because as we know, the first day of Cambrai goes very well, and there's expectation that days 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 are also going to go well. And in fact, it's really the opposite that occurs. But just bringing cavalry up within close range of major artillery concentrations is just really it's a nightmare. It's an absolute nightmare. As we just heard at Arras, if you do anything like make yourself obviously known when the Germans have still got a decent amount of defense in the area, and they do. Let's remember they're using a defense in depth system here. This isn't the elastic defense of 1915, but this is a much deeper set of defensive lines. It's not just about punching through a front line and disappearing off into the horizon. It's not into the blue anymore. It's more into the grey. You get through the front line and you've still got miles and miles and miles of stuff to take on, including things like dug-in artillery batteries that can also fire over iron sights and do absolute carnage to any large cavalry force. In addition, you have to contend with things like cavalry moving up. You've got to worry about the wounded moving back. You've got to worry about broken down tanks. You've got to worry about uncut sections of barbed wire. And as you say, canals crossing the battlefield. One tank famously drops a bridge just by its sheer weight, and that cuts off a huge opportunity for advance. And then cavalry in woods is an age-old problem. Try and drive cavalry through a wood, it's going to be really, really difficult, particularly in a First World War battlefield where half of that wood is lying in shattered pieces on the wood floor. A horse isn't going to pick its way through that with anything like speed. In fact, it's going to be a liability. A man can get through there much quicker. So in some senses, Spence, I think the cavalry's onto a bit of a hiding to nothing there. It's scapegoated, absolutely. And I think it's quite tragic if you look back at let's be fair, fairly glorious history of the cavalry. If you're a young officer, say in 1910, and you're looking to join the military and you're from a good family, good background, and you've got a great pedigree in the military, you're joining the cavalry. 1918, you are not. 1917, 1916, you are certainly not joining the cavalry. They've dropped significantly down the pecking order, and I think quite a lot of it unfairly.
I would absolutely agree with you. And on one hand, I think we have to acknowledge this is a war for national survival. Every fighting arm has to pull its weight. I can completely understand why tank crews, exhausted, overheated, covered with small cuts from bits of metal that are flying around their compartment and poisoned with carbon monoxide, are lying exhausted next to their tanks, are frustrated at the fact that the cavalry just never seem to show up. I can understand the infantry being frustrated, seeing cavalry milling around behind the lines, seemingly not getting involved. But I agree with you, Dan. Spare a thought for what the cavalry is asked to do here, because almost everything that can go wrong for the cavalry goes wrong at Cambrai. Once again, it's far too far away from the front line. It's 12 miles away from the front line on average at the start of the Battle of Cambrai. So its approach is 12 miles. That's too long for cavalry. They're going to lose any opportunity. And it's too long for the messages telling them as there's opportunity to get back to them. And the weather is very poor. There's not a lot of hours of daylight. Cavalry hasn't done much training alongside tanks, and so they're not experienced working with tanks. Tanks and cavalry can't communicate with each other. There's no obvious way you can get a message between the vehicle and the horseman, so that doesn't work. And I have to read a couple of quotes out to really capture this mood. And one is from a private knight of the 2nd Dragoon Guards who's at Cambrai, and he remembered the first day of the battle, which is meant to be when the cavalry is going to break through. He remembered, it was raining, a dismal rain, real November stuff that gradually wetted us through until eventually we could feel it trickling through our puttees. For hours we stood by our horses. Then at midnight we were told to off-saddle and peg down for the night. The prospect was by no means a cheerful one, but we lay down behind the horses to get what little sleep we could. And you can imagine, listeners, standing by your horses, waiting for orders that just never arrive for you to go forward and take action, being rained on all day until eventually daylight goes. And we've mentioned before this scapegoating of cavalry that follows. And Dan, you made a great point. If you're an ambitious young officer prior to the First World War and you have some money with you, because you do need a bit of money to be in the cavalry, you're probably going to go for the cavalry. Well, not by the end of 17. And Brigadier General Archibald Home of the Cavalry Corps, who is a prolific writer, about his experiences with the cavalry. He scribbles at the end of the Battle of Cambrai. He's completely fed up. And Home is a cavalryman through and through. And he scribbles down, "People at home ask, they had a great chance at Cambrai. Is it any use keeping them? They will never have such a chance again." That is the crux of the whole matter. On this, they may do anything. Make the cavalry into latrine caretakers. I shall be glad to have a rest. That is that. And if such a tough cavalryman as Archibald Home can, in a moment of just utter frustration, write down, "I don't care if we get turned into latrine caretakers," I think that captures a moment in the cavalry corps, reflect a really low mood at the end of 1917. And there's consequences too. The cavalry gets reduced on the Western Front. All of the Indian cavalry goes out to Palestine, where it's going to fight with a great deal of distinction. British cavalry reduces from 5 divisions to 3 divisions in very early 1918. And yet there's a sort of bitter irony here, Dan, because just as the cavalry is being reduced, it's about to experience its most important year since 1914.
Yeah, and it's that word again, movement. As soon as movement is introduced to the battlefield, and it happens in 2 major phases, of course, in 1918, once in March, not of the Allies' making, and then once again, really from July onwards, which is very much of the Allies' making, cavalry again can re-emerge as what I would argue is a really vital force to the battlefield. So perhaps less so, you could argue, in the March-Spring offensive. The role of cavalry at that point is going to be fairly isolated, but it is going to be crucial in some locations. When the Germans break through 21st of March 1918 and then continue to do so later in the month and then into April and even into May, once that movement starts to happen, you're going to get opportunities for the cavalry. Now, it might be a defensive rearguard screen. It might be grabbing onto a local objective. It may be charging over ambitious stormtrooper units who've pushed a little too far, all of which happen. But it does give opportunities on the battlefield. And so the cavalry, who have been undoubtedly frustrated, particularly through 1916 and really all of 1917, they really want to make their mark and show that they are. And let's remember, cavalry are not shy of a fight. They're more than happy to get stuck in when the opportunity presents itself. Problem is, it just hasn't presented itself for a year. So when it finally does, both in March and then later on, more importantly in the spring, in the 100 Days Offensive, they're really going to make their stamp as well.
They really are. In some ways, it's a shame for the British Army that there aren't more cavalry around in 1918. They're very, very useful in 1918. Cavalry are the principal reserve, in fact, down on Fifth Army's front in March 1918. They get very quickly thrown into to support the front line. And I think the way that the cavalry experiences March 1918 is testament to how flexible they've become. They're really an arm that can do everything, because 2nd and 3rd Cavalry Divisions are rushed up to the front line on the 21st of March as the Germans smash into 5th Army. They're actually rushed forward via motor transport and have to conduct this really grueling fighting retreat. They go back about 20 miles of continuous fighting before they're finally reunited with their horses 5 or 6 days later. And this is not easy. This is confused, desperate fighting where a lot of the cavalry is actually fighting on foot. Yes, it's trained to do this, but it's not expected to do this for 5 days at a stretch, and it's really grueling for them. But they're able to do it. They're that flexible. And as you say, Dan, there's also opportunities for cavalry, small groups of cavalry, to charge. You're in mobile warfare now. You're fighting through fields. You're fighting over villages, abandoned farmsteads and things. There's a lot more opportunity to maneuver, especially with small groups. And a sudden appearance of mounted cavalry can catch overextended German units by surprise in the battles of March 1918. And I'd like to read a quote, actually, from a cold steel charge that's launched by this small force. It's a mixed force, about 53 men, the 10th Dragoons, the Royals, and the 3rd Dragoon Guards, who charge a group, as you've described, Dan, an overextended German infantry group on the 24th of March. And one of the riders, Farrier Sergeant Albert Turp, he left a really evocative account of riding in this charge that I'd like to read out. And he remembered this. "We had, of course, been taught that a cavalry charge should be carried out in a line 6 inches from knee to knee, but it didn't work out like that in practice, and we were soon a pretty ragged line of horsemen at full gallop. We took the Germans quite by surprise, and they faced us as best they could, but there can't be anything more frightening to an infantryman than the sight of a line of cavalry charging at full gallop with drawn swords. I remembered my old training and the old sword exercise. As our line overrode the Germans, I made a regulation point at a man on my offside, and my sword went through his neck and out the other side. The pace of my horse carried my sword clear, and then I took a German on my near side, and I remembered the jar as my point took him in the collarbone and knocked him over. As we galloped on, the enemy broke and ran. And this is one of a number of small, sort of desperate charges, desperate counterattacks that can, if they catch German forces in the open, inflict casualties and take prisoners, such as the one we've just given an example of. And that ends to Terp's quote about there can't be much more terrifying than being charged as an exposed infantryman by a group of cavalry, I think is absolutely true. And we discussed on the Canter at War episode that Flowerdew Victoria crossed with the Canadians on the 30th of March in a cavalry charge too. So these do take place, small scale, and not all of them succeed. Sometimes the Germans are in place and they blast the cavalry as they appear. But when they do succeed, they can make a big difference. And that psychological element of cavalry charging, I think, is really important. It's an encouragement to the British troops, and it's a huge discouragement to the Germans.
I think the morale component here is really important and becomes more important in 1918 when morale really starts to dominate the conversation in terms of the bigger picture. You know, the Germans in March, there's a fair argument to say the morale is very high when they first break through the lines. But really, by the time you get to the end of May into June, and certainly by July, and it's realised that this great attack to win the war isn't going to win the war. In fact, it looks like the Allies are going to launch another attack. And now the 100 Days comes along. I wonder if, just on a psychological level, a German soldier who now sees a couple of hundred galloping horsemen with sabre in hand in some cases, moving in their general direction, and sees that they're very determined in that charge, I just wonder what that does to the infantryman's spirit. And I wonder if that really plays at least a small part in what's to come. Because really, from the 8th of August 1918, when the Battle of Amiens kicks off, we're going to see yet again cavalry back, and I think in a really vital role here. Bear in mind, this is often put down as an all-arms offensive, with the birth of combined arms, all arms. We've argued, I think, previously that really the Second Battle of the Marne might be the turning of the tide, but certainly Amiens is a very crucial one, and the phrase all arms is inclusive here. It does include cavalry.
It does, and this is finally the opportunity, perhaps that cavalry has been waiting for. If Arras and Cambrai were false dawns, because they're still going to involve all the complexities of a trench battlefield, Amiens is a little different. The trenches here, there are trenches, a lot of trenches at Amiens, but they're different. They're not as densely built. The barbed wire can be cut more easily. It's going to be a massive assault with over 500 tanks involved, plus significant quantities of cavalry involved. And finally, after all these years of hard fighting, the cavalry can coordinate better with the advancing infantry and the tanks. And because the ground is different, it's not as comprehensively destroyed as it had been in, let's say, Arras. It's not as dense as it is in parts of Cambrai. There's an opportunity here for the cavalry, and the cavalry probably has their best day of the war since 1914 at the Battle of Amiens, which is interesting to me because we often think in Britain about Amiens as a modern battle, a proto-blitzkrieg with low-flying aircraft, tanks, lots of artillery, machine guns, very advanced infantry tactics. But there's a real place for the cavalry here, and the cavalry sees that opportunity. Douglas Haig, who may be said to be a rather biased witness, he's of course a cavalryman, he's been waiting for this himself. He actually writes in his post-battle assessment of the Battle of Amiens, "I feel sure that without the rapid advance of cavalry, the effect of the surprise attack on the 8th would have been much less, and probably the Amiens outer defence would not have been gained either so soon or so cheaply." And I have to say, modern historical analysis largely agrees with Haig on this, that the cavalry play a crucial role because, as you've said, Dan, of this psychological element. One thing the British do with captured German officers in particular at the Battle of Amiens is they try and interview them very quickly to find out why they had surrendered. And One of my favorite accounts of this is a captured German infantry officer who surrendered a substantial unit, perhaps 50 men, well armed, but they've just laid down their weapons, they've put their hands up. And he's questioned, and he's actually a bit behind the lines at this stage, but apparently his answer is, look, look. And he points all around him and says, wherever you look, you see British cavalry. And that's something you would never have had a German officer say in 1916 or 1917. And if it's discouraging for the Germans to see all this cavalry, it's very reassuring for the Allied troops. And a quote from an officer of the 15th Hussars, which is worth reading out at length. There is little doubt that many felt that this moment was worth all the years of waiting. As the 15th swept past the position captured by the Canadians, these latter leapt to their feet and loudly cheered the regiment as it passed by. The distance to be covered was about 2,000 yards, and almost at once the 15th came under machine gun fire. A few men and horses fell, but the momentum was gained. The forward rush continued. In a remarkably short time, all squadrons reached their objectives, dismounted, and occupied the old trenches. And that's really the essence of what we've been talking about all episode, Dan. Speed kills, rushing through this fire, yes, taking casualties, but then very quickly seizing an objective. And horsemen are always going to reach that objective faster than the infantry. And that includes the German infantry coming up to try and serve as reserves.
Yeah, I just want to go back briefly because as you described it, I think it really kind of summed up that 100 days period where you talked about the German officer looking around saying, look, look, everywhere you look, there's British cavalry. I just want to make the point here that imagine now you're German in retreat at this point, and let's say you're part of a machine gun team or you're working an artillery piece, and all of a sudden you realize that there's been a breakthrough and you've got to withdraw. And if you've got to withdraw with an artillery piece or with a heavy machine gun and you've got to drag this thing out of the way and you've got to try and get back into a location where you can re-employ it, the very last thing that you want is cavalry operating in and around your vicinity, particularly on your flanks. Because moving a gun backwards is incredibly slow. Moving cavalry forwards, particularly on good ground in open fields, is very, very quick. You're going to be surrounded and cut off almost immediately. And actually, this is a big part of this kind of chase element. In fact, you could argue this is really what cavalry is designed to do. Once the enemy's in retreat, it's to chew up their rear areas, it's to force them to retreat, and it's to do exactly what the Brits tried to do, and all of the Allies for that matter, in 1918. And that's any time it looks like the Germans are going to put up any kind of determined stand to pressure them, to force them, to make them move again. And cavalry is fantastic at that role in 1918.
It is. It's got that advantage, especially once the Hindenburg Line is broken at the end of September and forces are manoeuvring out in effectively virgin fields so that haven't seen any significant action since, ironically enough, 1914. That ability to move, take an objective, or even threaten to take an objective, the psychological threat that this might be seized is very important. And the cavalry also goes back to doing other duties that have basically been forgotten since the War of Movement ended, like reconnaissance. Apart from the use of cavalry for reconnaissance during the retreat to the Hindenburg Line, cavalry really hasn't had that opportunity on the Western Front. But post the breaking of the Hindenburg Line, Germans always retreating, you need something to get back into contact with them. You need to actually be in touch with them and you establish their line of defense. Now, you can do that with aircraft, and aircraft are involved in this. But as we've said way back in the first episode about cavalry in 1914, aircraft can't then land and take a position, whereas cavalry can. They can carry out what's sometimes called a recce pull, where they will advance, they'll see an opportunity, they'll capture a small position, the infantry behind them will catch up and the cavalry will move off, and so the cavalry sort of drag the infantry onto them. If anything, I think in the 100 days, especially the second half of the 100 days, it's actual lack of numbers of cavalry that really hamper what the cavalry can do, because the cavalry shrunk at the start of 1918, and that cavalry that's gone to Palestine never comes back. And so across a huge battlefront, you're never going to get a massive amount of cavalry. You're going to get small units, squadrons really, maybe a regiment here and there, maybe a brigade here and there. It's not that much cavalry for you to actually use. And it's interesting that it's always in demand. People always want the cavalry. It's not to say the cavalry's perfect. There are problems. There's setbacks in the 100 Days too. Cavalry still struggle to coordinate with tanks. This inability for the two units to communicate with each other is really, really problematic. Never gets solved in the war. Cavalry can still sometimes find themselves in difficulties in areas where they need to cross major obstacles and things like this. But where cavalry shows up in the 100 Days, where British cavalry, and indeed Canadian and Australian cavalry is around, it's effective. And that's really fascinating to me that they've had effectively 3 years of disappointment from the end of 1915 up to the start of 18. And yet, they've never stopped developing. They've always retained their cavalry spirit, which we discussed previously. And although they might be still using swords and lances, they're augmenting that with grenades, machine guns, and mortars. And in a battlefield where petrol-driven vehicles are still not really the dominant arm, really the cavalry are what you're going to use for your aggressive mobility.
And that's exactly what we see right up to the very end of the war. In fact, I think it's really quite fitting when we started this with part one of this look at cavalry. We spoke about that first British engagement at Casteau, just outside Mons in August 1914, where a British cavalry patrol clashed with a German cavalry patrol. It's quite nice to think that actually right back to the 11th of November 1918, less than a few hundred yards away from that, on the final morning of the war, it's yet again cavalry that's making its way through there, probing the Germans as they fall back into what would inevitably prove to have been into Germany itself. And when the war comes to an end, it's not British infantry, but it's British cavalry. They're at the tip of the spear once more.
A circular story, really, from, as you say, the tip of the spear in 1914 to the tip of the spear in 1918. What's really changed is that in 1914, you have 6 infantry divisions and a cavalry division. By 1918, you've got 3 cavalry divisions and dozens of infantry divisions. So the cavalry are always going to play a smaller role in this, but they still play an important one. And as we bring this to a conclusion, it's worth mentioning, listeners, that, of course, cavalry plays a really important role on other fronts. It does really important work, whether that's British, Anzac, and Indian cavalry in the Middle East, German cavalry on the Eastern Front, especially in Romania, or one that I think not many people will be that aware of, and that's French cavalry in the latter stages of the war on the Salonika front and the advance into Bulgaria, where French cavalry does very, very well once the trench lines there collapse. And so there's still a place for cavalry in the First World War. And I think, Dan, we've illustrated that there's even a place for it on the Western Front. It might not be the arm that is going to win the First World War. It might not be the arm that's going to break the Western Front. But it's significant that the British retaining this cavalry element is able to get a lot out of it despite its limited numbers in 1918. And it does raise a what if that was noted at the time. What if the Germans had had a few cavalry divisions in 1918 ready to go forward when they drove in Fifth Army? Would it have made a difference?
Well, it's a big question. And I, for one, I'm kind of glad that they never did and we don't have to find out the answer to that. But it certainly would have changed the equation somewhat. I think I want to agree with you, Spence, in terms of wrapping this one up and kind of looking at the bigger picture. Certainly cavalry plays a part. And I hope over these last 2 episodes, we've really shown that even on the Western Front, where a kind of cursory glance will tell you there's no way that cavalry can operate successfully. Not only does it do so in 1914, it does so in 1918, and in isolated incidents, actually during trench warfare itself. So, from cavalry really falling from grace in that middle part of the war, I wonder, does it reclaim, Spence, some of its lost pride by the end of the war?
To an extent, and even the kindest viewer of cavalry, the kindest assessment of cavalry, which are produced, of course, at the end of the war and indeed in the years immediately following the war, acknowledged that cavalry was never decisive, at least not after 1914. Although the British cavalry does acknowledge it was very useful in the spring offensives as this mobile reserve, and it played a role in the 100 Days. I think there's a recognition that the days of cavalry are ultimately, they've entered their sunset period. The advancements in motor technology and vehicle technology, the speed with which tanks are developing in the 1920s means that cavalry is going to gradually fade away. But it's not going to disappear anytime soon. The sun is going to set on it, but it's going to take a long time to disappear behind the horizon. And there's still cavalry being used in the Second World War in quite large numbers on various fronts. And I think another thing to just end on and really focus on is something we might be tempted to say, well, it must have been very easy as a cavalryman. Didn't see that much fighting, a lot of time behind the lines. And there are commentators from the First World War, veterans, who look at it that way. In actual fact, being a cavalryman is hard work. It's really hard work. You've got to be a skilled rider. You've got to be as good with a rifle as you are with a sword. You've got to care for your horse constantly, which is a very busy, demanding workload. You form a bond with your horse too. So if your horse is killed or wounded or becomes sick, that can be very difficult for you. And you've got to put up with this constant criticism as well. The cavalry is painfully aware of. And yet, I think the British cavalry leaves the Western Front very much with its head held high at the end of the First World War. Listeners, if you're not convinced by me, perhaps you'll be convinced by Corporal of Horse Lloyd, who we actually quoted in the 1914 episode too, who'd been with the cavalry since 1914, served through them the entire First World War and survived. And he remembered at the end of it all, he remembered this: during the best years of my life, I had given to the cavalry the best that was in me and received precious little in return. I would gladly go through it all again for the sake of the good times spent in company of the great fellows of all ranks who are my comrades.
You've been listening to Not So Quiet on the Western Front, a Battle Guide production. If you've enjoyed this podcast, why not check out the Battle Guide YouTube channel, where we regularly release documentaries exploring some of the most famous and extraordinary episodes from throughout military history. If you'd like to support the Battle Guide team to create more content just like this, why not head over to our Patreon, where for the cost of just a cup of coffee, you can get access to full-length virtual battlefield tours, exclusive behind-the-scenes content, decide which subjects we cover in future podcasts and videos, and join a fantastic community of like-minded people. That's all this time. See you again soon.
I'm raring to go. I've had so much coffee today that I might just jump out of my chair. So excited.
Yeah. Nice. Well, let's do it. Let's give it a go.
Right, let's mount up and charge.
Touche.
All the best jokes.
When we started this episode yesterday with the opening, wasn't yesterday, was it?
No.
Whenever it was.
Yeah, forgive me for rambling a bit about it, but it's cool. It's cool, I wouldn't have wanted to charge on a horse. I'd have probably fallen off the bloody thing and had my neck broken instantly. But it's, of all the arms in the First World War, I could see myself riding with the cavalry more than I could choking to death in a tank. But that's maybe just me.